Hello everyone, I'm Daz and welcome to American Civil War and UK History. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel and as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And remember, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and TikTok. This year is the 160th anniversary of America's single bloodiest day in history, which is of course the Battle of Antietam. And joining me today is two very good friends. We have Tyler McGraw, the Unfiltered Historian. Good evening, Tyler.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Daz.
And we have Tim Willging. Good evening, Tim.
Evening, how are you?
Good, thank you. Before we discuss the battle, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the Maryland campaign. At the beginning of September 1862, Robert E. Lee decides to invade Maryland in the hope of rallying support from the people in Maryland and, of course, from the foreign powers abroad. He splits his army of Northern Virginia. Jackson goes to Harper's Ferry, and D.H. Hill is sent to South Mountain to defend Lee's rear. The Union, George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac. After defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, John Pope's army is put together with the Army of the Potomac, and Lincoln reluctantly gives overall command to George McClellan. On September the 13th, Corporal Barton W. Mitchell finds a piece of paper wrapped around 3 cigars known as Special Order 191, which has Lee's plans on. McClellan famously says, "For here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I'll be willing to go home." On Wednesday, September 17th, 1862, the scene is set for what will become the single bloodiest day in American history. So let's quickly look at the two armies. You have, obviously, commander of the Army of the Potomac, you have George McClellan, strength 87,000, around about there. And the Army of the Potomac commander, the Army of North Virginia commander, Robert E. Lee, strength 45,000. And so there we are. So we get to Antietam. So, okay, let's talk about the morning phase and the Cornfield. So, Tim, would you like to start, please, mate?
Sure. So early morning, really about dawn, or just before, the Union Army will begin its advance. They begin it on their right, so opposite Lee's left, in the northern part of what's now the Antietam battlefield. And they're on a farm known as the Poffenberger Farm, owned by Jacob Poffenberger. And it's the Union First Corps, about 9,000 men under the command of Joseph Hooker, that lead this advance. And their objective is high ground in vicinity of what's known as the Dunker Church. The Dunkers being a German pacifist Baptist sect. They believe in baptism by immersion, hence the name Dunkers. So they have a small whitewashed church, kind of built into the eastern edge of what's known as West Woods, opposite a relatively high plateau that becomes kind of the key terrain for the battlefield. It's currently the site of the visitor center, and that's really the Union objective. There had been, sparse fighting in vicinity of the East Woods the night before, so soldiers knew that a battle was imminent. But about first light, they start moving through the cornfield. It's, I believe, Doubleday's division, if I'm not mistaken. Because you have Doubleday, Ricketts, and Meade are the division commanders, but they'll begin the advance crossing the cornfield. Will engage throughout the southern edge of the cornfield. The Confederates are opposite them, just outside the corn. Pretty sharp fighting. Behind them, you've got you've got Ricketts' division. I may have got those two mixed up, but then that division is spearheaded really by a brigade of Westerners. At the time known as the, Black Hat Brigade. They may or may not have been bestowed the name they're more familiar by, of the Iron Brigade a couple days earlier at South Mountain. But these are 3 regiments of Wisconsinites, the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin. the 19th Indiana, and they will move on. Basically straddling the Hagerstown Turnpike, 2 regiments in the corn and 2 regiments off to the west side of the turnpike, where they will engage elements of Jackson's wing in and just beyond the cornfield. So that pretty much covers the earliest part of the morning phase.
Okay. Now, it's described as artillery held the cornfield. So, Tyler, would you like to jump in and talk about the artillery on the bridge?
No, and absolutely. So, and that morning when you have those elements of the Union forces moving through the cornfields and getting ready to meet with Confederate forces there on the outer perimeter, you're going to have a deluge of artillery shells raining from both sides. So across the Antietam Creek and over on this plateau by the Dunker Church. Now, the Dunker Church, being that whitewashed brick building owned by that German pacifist sect Dunkers, sits really, really nicely on this rise of ground that almost commands the field at that point. And it's arguably said that the Dunker Church could potentially be the key to the battlefield here. And it's definitely the objective point of Hooker here on September 17th. But this artillery duel that takes place is dubbed artillery hell, Darren, like you just said. And the reason for that is the amount of concentrated fire that is arcing back and forth between the positions. And this leads into one of my favorite stories of Antietam, where we get a little personal there. And for those that have followed the Unfiltered Historian, you've seen that I posted recently about an ancestor of mine who fought with Parker's Virginia Battery, who was in Stephen D. Lee's battery. So this artillery battery parked here by the Dunker Church, Stephen D. Lee is in charge of, and Parker's battery fits into that position there as well. Well, it's not even 20 to 30 minutes into the onslaught of this artillery duel when Duffy's going to be wounded and taken out of the fight. Now, when he's wounded, he's commanding a gun there on that plateau, and a mini ball will slam into his leg. And when that mini ball slams into his leg, he immediately crawls off the field, and somewhere in the rear of the battery, he's able to find a surgeon, and the surgeon realizes that the ball just needs to be simply extracted. It's nothing that's going to cause or require amputation, but it's still something that needs to be obviously addressed. You don't want to walk around with a lead ball stuck in your leg the rest of your life. So he is offered whiskey and denies the whiskey, declines that, saying that he is a good Christian Irishman. He would just take water. And without any anesthetics at all, the ball was removed. And now Parker's battery doesn't stop firing just because Duffy's taking out. In fact, Parker's battery stays on the field for a decent amount of time, considering what they're facing. There's another story about a young boy, and for those that don't know, Parker's battery is known as the boy battery for the median age range of the battery itself. Captain William Watts Parker is a physician out of Richmond who has, I don't want to say commandeered, but almost kind of urged some of his patients to join his battery. S.D. Lee himself will give the men a very rousing speech just prior to Antietam, say that you men have been, or you boys have been where men only dare to go. And the name Boy Battery really has just kind of stuck from there. But while they're fighting there, this incident takes place where there's a member of the battery who Parker is trying to ultimately save from this fight. The age is just too young to be fighting in his eyes, and the father of this child wants him back home and wants him removed from the battery. So in an effort to keep him away from the fight, Parker kind of keeps him to the rear of the caissons. Well, unfortunately, that's actually going to be the cause of this young man's death, and I believe his last name is Kenny or Kelly, one of the two. I'd have to look up in the Parker's battery book to make sure and just to confirm that. But ultimately, he's killed at 15 years old, just behind the battery there when that duel is taking place. And Parker's battery is ultimately going to retire to a position that is located in what is today the Antietam National Cemetery. But the ground that they were holding and that part of S.D. Lee's line was, again, arguably a very important part of that battlefield, sitting right there on that plateau outside of the Dunker Church, across the Hagerstown Pike from it, at least.
Okay, cool. Tim, can I bring you in? Because during the cornfield, there is some hungry Texans. Can you tell us that story?
Yep,
some
sure.
hungry Texans.
Yeah. So a couple things. Let me reiterate. So I said Jacob Poffenberger Farm. It's actually Joseph Poffenberger Farm, and it was both the divisions of Doubleday and Ricketts attacked. Ricketts was closer to the East Woods, Doubleday closer to the West Woods. So they basically overwhelmed the Confederate divisions. Initially, you had General Lawton's brigade division at the southern end. You had Hayes's Louisianians there. And they're shifting constantly. The Confederates are moving around all over the place. You have regiments just mixing. But eventually the weight of Union numbers begins to tell. Well, at the time all this is happening, still morning, you have John Bell Hood's division, namely the Texas Brigade in vicinity of Dunkirk Church. And they're actually sitting down to eat their first meal in a couple days. So these are, as you said, pretty hungry Texans. So they're ordered to form up, and they'll move across the Hagerstown Turnpike. They're livid that they're missing their first meal. So, and the entire Confederate position's under threat, and they'll, form up opposite the Dunkirk Church across the Hagerstown Turnpike in what the American Battlefield Trust has labeled the epicenter of the battle of the area between across the Hagerstown Pike and between Dunkirk Church and the southern end of the Cornfield. And they'll launch a counterattack into the Cornfield, push the Union troops before them, and make it pretty much the other end of the Cornfield, where they'll run into another Union division just upcoming under George Gordon Meade. It's his division of Pennsylvania Reserves, which at this stage of the war is in the First Corps. They'll deliver a volley and cut down the Texas Brigade mercifully. But, that's the brigade's name, somewhat a misnomer. They have the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas, the 18th Georgia, and then Hampton's Legion. South Carolinians. But you notice in the Trelawney painting there's the Texas flag. I believe that is the 1st Texas. And they'll lose multiple color guards. They'll end up losing the colors in the corn. In the 1st Texas will suffer 82% casualty rate in the Cornfield. In the meantime, they're catching flanking fire from the other side of the Hagerstown Turnpike from a battery that's quite famous, especially those who are familiar with the Iron Brigade. It's Battery B, 4th U.S. Artillery, formerly commanded at the beginning of the war by John Gibbon, who is now the commander of the Iron Brigade. And he's actually helping to work the battery at this time, which is more or less for the next couple of years going to be attached pretty much to the Iron Brigade. He'll run up the elevating screw, which means basically pointing the barrel down towards the ground and fire double loads of canister bouncing across the road into the faces of Hampton's Legion, the Georgians, and the Texans that are forming there on the fence to combat this flanking fire that they get. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Hooker's Corps are in the Cornfield, and then they need support. So enter the 12th Corps. So talk about the 12th Corps coming onto the field, please, if you wouldn't mind, Tim.
Yeah, 12th Corps got a new commander at the time, by a guy by the name of Joseph Mansfield. And there's his monument there on the battlefield in vicinity of where he died. There's some discrepancy as to where that actually was. But his corps will kind of advance from the north and northeast. And he's actually wounded pretty early in the fight. He's co-located himself with the 10th Maine. So if you've seen any of the videos on our podcast, I am a fan of the 10th Maine. I don't have a grandfather at Antietam, but I do have a cousin, fairly distant cousin. But so I've been following this regiment for a while. And they'll basically fight at the northern northeastern edge of the East Woods. And the fighting's actually ferocious there. It's somewhat overlooked given the ferocity of the fighting in the Cornfield. But it's really back and forth. Union troops will push into East Woods. The Confederates will push them out. More Union reinforcements will arrive. So it is a free-for-all, every bit as the free-for-all they labeled the West Woods at. But Mansfield's wounded. They're along with the 10th Maine at the northeastern part of the East Woods, and will be, lift off his horse and carried to the rear, where he will later die in a Union field hospital. Corps command is taken over, I think, by Alpheus Williams, who will, he has the misfortune or fortune of continuously being elevated to temporary command of the Corps. He'll be in command briefly several times, Gettysburg being one of them. Not really, I don't recall off the top of my head if he actually obtains full command of the Corps, because I think when they merge with the 11th Corps later, it will go to Slocum, or to Hooker, I believe. Excuse me. But the 12th Corps, for probably the third consecutive fight, actually fights really well, despite having been one of the, Shenandoah Valley victims of Stonewall Jackson. They fight really well at Cedar Mountain. They fight, they fail but fight well at Second Manassas or Bull Run, and then they fight really well at Antietam, and it's really part of a trend. So, yeah, did that cover it, Des?
Yeah, thank you. Tyler, do you want to add anything about Mansfield and that part of the battle?
Nothing about Mansfield, but something of interest came up today when I was doing just a little quick research on some of the features of the battlefield itself. And this is a little off closer to the Cornfield and the Dunker Church area, but I wanted to talk quickly about the Muma Farm, if that was okay, Daz.
Yeah, go for it.
So it's one of the things that I kind of overlook when I look in. I think maybe not many of us do, but I know I for sure do when I look into some of the civilian tolls that is taken at this battle. And one of those is the property destruction that you're seeing at the Muma Farm. So the Muma Farm itself was built in 1790, and that was built on a place or an eminence known as Smith's Hill. And when it was built, it was initially owned by Jacob Muma, who would give it to his son Samuel, which would be the wartime owner. And we're talking the Civil War, who would then turn it over to his son. So I'm corrected on that, actually. His son Samuel would be the one to own it during the Civil War. As the story goes with the Muma Farm, on the 15th, Confederates will actually visit the Muma Farm and sort of warn the Muma family that there is going to, be a presence of troops here, and that it might be of haste to get out, to evacuate. And so they do. And Samuel Jr. and his brother wanted to return for some spare clothing in case they were going to be gone for a while, and they're going to make that return on the evening of the 16th. And when they do, they actually get detained by D.H. Hill and his staff. And the reason for the detainment is to try to get a better understanding of the roads and just some of the local byways that they're able to use if needs be when it comes to military purposes. Well, during the battle, the Muma Farm will host many different troop movements and a lot of different scenarios happening there. But one thing that's of note is General Roswell Ripley, a Confederate general, will actually order the Muma Farm burned to the ground. And the Confederates go to approach the house. They see an open window, which presumably was left open by Samuel Jr., and they drop their torch in, and the house goes up in flames. It's also of note to know that the destruction of that property was a lot heavier than one might seem to think. Not only are you losing your house, but at the start of the Civil War, the Muma Farm boasted of 16 acres of corn, 60 acres of wheat, 20 to 30 acres of pasture. Their livestock, they were running somewhere around 200 chicken, 15 hogs, 20 heads of cattle, and a vast number of horses. All of that presumably was also gone when the battle took place, because obviously horses are in great need. All that livestock could feed an army, if not just kind of chased away from the cacophony of battle surrounding this farmstead. So it's of note to kind of remember too, when we're talking about a lot of the soldier accounts that happened, that some of these civilians that are living on the battlefield lose everything too. The Muma Farm was absolutely ruined after this battle. So I just kind of wanted to talk just briefly about that. There's a lot of accounts from soldiers seeing this huge orange glow at that sector of the field, and that's attributed to the burning Mumma farm.
Oh wow! Thanks for adding that. Yeah,
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for letting me share.
and it's nice to hear that side of the story. It's not just about the fighting; it's about the people that live there. Yes,
right. And they actually moved to another house in the area that's very famous too. If you're looking down at the Burnside Bridge sector, there's two houses really close to that, the Otto farm and the Sherrick farm. And the Mumma family would live at the Sherrick farm until their home was finally rebuilt in June of 1863. So that's something else worth noting, that there's still there's a community here in Sharpsburg. And it's really evident because you're seeing the Mumma family actually living with the Sherrick family over there by the Burnside Bridge, as it would be known later. We know it as the Rohrbach Bridge if we're studying it.
Okay. Well, thanks for that.
Yeah,
so
sure.
anyway, we're gonna stay with the cornfield for a minute, because obviously when I visited, you guys took me to a really cool place, and it involves the Iron Brigade. And the Iron Brigade goes around the cornfield, and then you took me to this cool little place which I wouldn't have known was there unless I was with you guys. So, Tim, would you like to talk about the ledge that's there, please?
Oh, that is such a flattering picture of me too. Thank you.
So this is us, guys. Sorry, just before you start, Tim, this is us. There is a video on the Unfiltered Historian's YouTube channel. Go and check it out. I did post it up the other day, and it is about this. Tim, tell us about this, please, mate.
So yeah, as I mentioned, so early in the morning, you're talking before 7 o'clock in the morning. Gibbon's brigade enters action in the cornfield. So the 2nd and the 6th Wisconsin are in the cornfield, proper, moving to the south edge. The 7th and the Wisconsin and the 19th Indiana, however, move around to the right across the farm of D.R. Miller, who owns the cornfield, also the pasture land across the Hagerstown Pike. So they will move to the west. And if you remember when we were there, the terrain below this ledge, so behind the camera, is low ground. So they're completely out of sight to anyone up, in vicinity of the cornfield. Very low terrain. There's part of the West Woods kind of moves up north there. And there are no Confederates in there at that time. So what they find is moving up back towards the sound of the guns, they see the hill off to their left, so they climb it. And when they get to this ledge where the picture's taken, they are looking at the backs of the Confederates lined up. I don't know if in the picture you can see it too well here, but you're looking at the backs of the Confederates lined up on the western side of the Hagerstown Pike, firing into the cornfield. These are Jones, I think David R. Jones and Grigsby's brigades at first. There's some Louisianians under Hayes there. So really the ledge provides a natural fortification. And it's even better for the 7th Wisconsin and 19th Indiana, is continues to slope up to this ridge line, or to this fence line. So the Confederates are not only, right in front of them, it not necessarily point blank range, it's probably about 60 yards or so, but they're also silhouetted in front of them, which makes the shooting much easier. And with all the noise, the Wisconsinites and the Indianans are able to, shoot pretty much unfettered into the backs of the Confederates, and eventually they figure out and they route back to the south. But it provided an incredible opportunity for these Iron Brigade men there. And it's, once again, it's a place not a whole lot of people go to or is frequently talked about.
No, and that was what was really cool seeing that in my visit. So I really appreciate you taking me there. So if anyone visits Antietam, please go and see that. Okay, so the battle's going to shift now to a really famous farm lane, and which will be known as Bloody Lane eventually. So, Tyler, do you want to start with this one, mate?
Yeah, absolutely. I can take us off here. So now we're looking closer to midday. And thing about Antietam to kind of really keep in the back of your minds as we're going through this today is that the battle is fought in sectors, or sort of in sections. There's like actions that are kind of moving throughout, and it's almost in, or phases. You know what? That's a better word for it. We should say the battle is being fought in phases. So we're looking at midday, and we're looking at sort of a natural defensive position. Now I say natural, and the reason it's sort of serving as a natural trench, but it's an old wagon road that the Confederates under D.H. Hill are going to be able to secure. And these Confederates under D.H. Hill are trying to stop French's big division comparatively. D.H. Hill's commanding roughly 2,500 men, and French has almost double that, if not more than double. So French is attacking over some ground that's less favorable to the Confederates, who are in this naturally, jutted, sunken wagon road. And French is going to launch brigade-sized assaults against D.H. Hill's Confederates in those breastworks. And it's going to start around 9:30. So I say midday, but, when we're talking Civil War, this battle started at the crack of dawn. Once that rain sort of filtered out, that fog was still hanging, the battle starts. We're looking at it close to 9:30 when the first few of those brigades are going to move forward and try to hit D.H. Hill's men in the road there. There's a significant ferocity to this. There's a line of troops moving forward, and they're going to get rather close to the Confederates there in the Bloody Lane, as it's later called, when they're told to fire on them, and the first line sees staggering numbers fall. There's going to be another brigade behind it that's very famously known as the Irish Brigade, who will also be using something very interesting here at the Bloody Lane. They're going to be firing with buck and ball, your predecessor to buckshot, if you will. And that's really only effective when you're up close. It's not something you want to use when you're far away. So this means that the Irish Brigade is going to have to get a little close for this to be effective. Eventually, the Bloody Lane is overrun by the Union forces attacking it, and Confederates will start to melt back into the Piper cornfield directly behind it. Tim, if you have some more you want to add into this, please help me out. I hope I covered just briefly kind of what's happening at the Bloody Lane, giving an overview. I'm sure you could, dive a little more in depth into what's going on over here.
Yeah, one thing that I actually pointed out, I think there is a perception that because the attacks, occurred piecemeal, and they did, that they occurred at separate phases of the day. And one of the things that came out over a weekend, and if you read Priest's book with his breakdown by time, you see that the morning, afternoon, evening phase thing really isn't necessarily the case. Part of the issue is the Second Corps that's launching this attack, they get badly split up, but they're in action, or they're across Antietam Creek by 8:30 in the morning.
Right.
So you have French's division is attacking round about 9 o'clock.
So midday wouldn't be something to really call midday.
Yeah, it's not midday. The best way to phrase it is kind of like the middle phase. And some people think also like French hit just like the left edge, whereas Richardson hit more the right side of the lane. That's also not really true. Most of the maps, like this one, I think that's Park Service, shows it that way. French is kind of straddled, was slightly to the left of that bend there in Hill's line, but it really straddled it. You had the 8th Ohio more, and if you're standing there, where the picture's taken, and you look to the left, what's right in front of you? It's this giant hill. The field of fire is actually pretty awful from the Confederate perspective.
Yes, it is. And we discussed that. In order to see anything from that part of the lane, you basically have to be on your tiptoes at that fence line. So the natural trench in that part of the road is useless. Now, on the left side of it, and that's more where John Gordon is, or John B. Gordon in the 6th Alabama, I believe. They're shooting uphill, and they have good line of sight.
up that hill towards kind of the visitor center, right of it, looking towards the Muma farm. And there, they're able to get a better bead. But the 8th Ohio has better luck, and they're on the right side of that roulette lane that pretty much divides the two parts of the sunken road. And there they're able to get better cover. And it's really the 8th Ohio that's the first regiment that starts inflicting casualties on the Confederates. They stand there at the military crest, just, where they can duck down, get a little bit of shelter, pop back up and fire. Eventually they run out of ammunition too. And then Richardson's division will come up more to the right, to include units under, Francis Barlow's there. And they do hit more the right side of the road, kind of down towards where that observation tower is, where the field of fire is longer, but the Confederates just don't have the strength to spread and cover that. I guess one of the other interesting stories is that of John Gordon. He'll be hit in the, wounded multiple times. He'll be wounded in the shoulder. And I think he's wounded in the arm as well. But the big one is the event ends up getting wounded in the face. And there's, rarely ever got photographed from the left side, showing the left side of his face after that. But after war, there is one picture of him showing the left side of what's still a very clear hole in his cheek. And that caused him to pass out. And he fell down face first into his cap. And he would have drowned in his own blood if it weren't for the fortunate fact that a Federal bullet had entered and pierced a hole in his cap, allowing the blood to drain out. Wow. Otherwise, the Confederacy would have been denied his services at a relatively early stage. Keep in mind, he's just a regimental commander. He will eventually end the war as one of Lee's corps commanders, is generally regarded tactically as one of Lee's best. But at this stage, he's still somewhat obscure. But another thing that Gordon at this is, he'll comment on, call it the pageantry of the attack, and he'll talk about how big a shame it was to wreck, the scene of what he called martial beauty. Because the Second Corps was pretty impressive moving across, and it could have been, even worse. Sedgwick's division got split off. I won't say lost, and it's debatable whether Sedgwick or French and Richardson were the ones that split off. But if all three had been there, that attacking that area could have been potentially even worse for the Confederates than it ended up being, because after they smashed through and pushed the Confederates back, there's really very little off on the other side of the Piper farm, it's in the center picture there. It's what's off to the right of the observation tower and behind. There's no infantry there. And in fact, General Longstreet brings his own staff up to a cannon and directs his staff firing this cannon to slow the Federals, all while he's wearing carpet slippers. So pretty.
I heard that story first from you while we were up in that tower, because I was like, I've never heard that before. That was a very fun one to kind of hear out there.
Yep. So, guess that's it.
Yeah, and when you look at the numbers, you can see why it was called Bloody Lane in the end, because 5,600 men dead or wounded, and it's just in this part of the battlefield is horrendous, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay, guys, let's move to the next phase then. So we have one of the most famous parts of the battle, and that is Burnside's Bridge. The Ninth Corps have been ordered not to move until told, and then the delay in the orders, they don't actually move till 10 a.m. So, Tim, do you want to start with Burnside's Bridge?
Sure. So again, this is taking place around about 10:30 in the morning. You'll have the 2nd Maryland, I believe, is the first unit that's going to try to attack across what's known as the lower bridge. So there are 3 bridges. At the time, this is just known as the lower bridge over Antietam Creek, pretty much directly opposite Sharpsburg there on the map. At the Boonesboro Road, you'll have the middle bridge, and that's really being addressed by elements of Fitz-John Porter's 5th Corps. But you have Burnside's 9th Corps, relative newcomers to the Army of the Potomac. They were refugees, so to speak, from John Pope's Army of Virginia, and they're under a new corps commander. It's just a couple days prior to this, they'd been under command of Major General Jesse Reno, who unfortunately was killed on South Mountain, as we talked about in our podcast a couple weeks ago, or a week or so ago, whatever. So now, Ambrose Burnside's back basically in command of the Corps, though he'll say he's a wing commander, but this will be labeled as his operation, even if he isn't. I think he's giving this commands through Cox. Am I correct? Let me double check. I don't want to misspeak.
Jacob Cox, you're right.
Yeah, through Jacob Cox. So he's got a couple objectives. He's trying to not only get across the bridge, which is, of course, the easiest route, but he's going to send a division down to the south to try to find a ford. Boteler's Ford, I think, is that one. Am I correct? Is that the name of it?
Boteler's Ford is correct. It's like Jeopardy over here.
Oh, sweet. So they will... Or no, Snavely's Ford. It's right there.
Sorry, Boteler's is
Yeah,
it's further south. It's not great.
Yeah.
Snavely's
So
Ford.
Snavely's Ford. So he'll send elements of his corps down that way, while the rest will try to get across the middle bridge, or the lower bridge. Excuse me, I'm all over the place right now.
We could call it Rohrbach Bridge too, if you really wanted to.
Yeah.
Yes, you could. So the first cross will be the 2nd Maryland and the 6th New Hampshire. It's Rodman's division heading towards Snavely's Ford, so just totally overlooked. And the Confederates opposing them are really in a fix, because, and Lee gets a lot of credit for this, but it also, had side effects. So throughout the battle, as Union forces are putting pressure first in the north, and then towards the middle, towards Blay Lane, which is also still kind of on the northern sector, if you think about it. He's pulling from his middle section there across around the Boonesboro Pike, what's now the cemetery area. And the lower sector, you have Armistead's Brigade, Kemper, and those guys will move further north towards the town, just in case that fighting around the Muma Farm, around Bloody Lane gets worse. That way they can, pitch into it. So Burnside, Jacob Cox will be there on the east side, and what the picture there of Blay Lane doesn't show, it's high ground on that side. The ridge goes down, and their first attempt will be from below the bridge. In fact, the first couple attempts will be from below the bridge. The 2nd Maryland, 6th New Hampshire will try to run up the road that comes there from the south up towards the bridge. They don't get there. They're basically shot down en route. The next attempt will be no more successful. You've got the 35th Mass also moved from the south. Don't get very far, and then you have which brigade is it? Ferrero's brigade, I believe, tries from the north side. I think that's 48th Pennsylvania, yeah. And they basically get pinned down there along the stone wall opposite this side. And finally, there are the two 51st, the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania, called a demi-brigade if you want. They'll rush down the hill from directly opposite the bridge, and they're basically promised, they want their whiskey ration. So they ask their commander, if we take the bridge, can we get our whiskey? And they, commander responds by God, yes. And one will take cover there. That is an original witness tree, probably the coolest single artifact there on the battlefield. One regiment will take cover and return fire against the Georgians defending the opposite bank under Toombs, and that's Toombs's view. The other one will be on the right side of the bridge. That's the 51st Pennsylvania. No, 51st Pennsylvania on the stone wall, 51st New York on the fence on the right side of the bridge as we're looking at it here. Returning fire. And finally, and really what is a soldier's fight, individual men just start to rush across the bridge. Men will fall on the bridge, but eventually, they'll carry it, drive the Confederates out of rifle pits and from, the stone quarry where they were also taking cover. That first picture from the Confederate side actually is from vicinity of the quarry. And that's the 20th Georgia there, the 2nd Georgia from the quarry to the south. But they'll be driven back, and then Burnside's men will begin to stream across. But they don't immediately continue their advance, and that's what ultimately proves costly. I don't know if you want me to go into that now or...
just hold fire on that for a moment, if you wouldn't mind. So, Tyler, do you want to add anything about Burnside's bridge?
No, I think Tim's doing a fantastic job of covering that, yeah.
And again, like you said, Tim, so it takes 2 hours for him to get across the bridge with his guys. I mean, mind you, saying that, there must have been a lot of men on the bridge to move before you can even get across there. But like you said, the Confederates are going to get pushed back into Sharpsburg, leading to a very famous person turning up. It's like a Hollywood movie. You couldn't write it. And Tyler, I'm going to get you to talk about this. And it's Hill's Light Division.
That's correct. So, AP Hill's Light Division. They have a heck of a march ahead of them from this position. They're going to start out around Harper's Ferry today, West Virginia. Hill's Light Division is going to have to embark on an exhausting 17-mile march in order to get to the position on the battlefield. And by the time that Hill's division actually arrives, Burnside's men are almost on the outskirts, if not the outskirts of Sharpsburg itself. And this caught the Federal Army completely unaware when 3,000 Confederates show up and are directly in front of them. The plan initially under Burnside was to try to move around the weakened Confederate flank and move directly onto Sharpsburg. And theory, that's cutting Lee's army off from retreat. That's where Baudelaires Ford will come into play, and that's over by Shepherdstown. So the 79th New York is one of the ones we'll feature here. They're going to be one of the few that are actually able to break through Confederate lines in the divisions. Jones's outnumbered division will be taken by the 79th New York on a place known as Cemetery Hill, and I'm sure you can imagine why it is called Cemetery Hill. No, we're not talking about Gettysburg. We are indeed talking about Antietam. At 3:30 p.m., that is when Hill will arrive on the field, and 2 brigades will move southeast to guard the flank, and the other 3, roughly 2,000, move to the right of Toombs' brigade and launch their infamous counterattack. Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg, who will ultimately fall at Fredericksburg in December of 1862, had a brigade of South Carolinians, which would attack some of Rodman's men. I believe the 16th Connecticut is the one there on the flank that they hit. And they hit him in the cornfield of one of the farms I mentioned earlier. The owner of the farm is named John Otto, so this is the Otto farm. And the Connecticut men had been in service for roughly 3 weeks when they were attacked, so their line just evaporated. They took about 185 casualties, and the 4th Rhode Island, to their right, pretty much came up with the same results. The 8th Connecticut was by themselves, the only one left. They were enveloped and taken down the hill, back towards the creek they had just crossed, known as the Antietam. Gave the 9th Corps an aggregate of 20% casualties after crossing that bridge. So AP Hill's light division wasn't so light when you really think about it. They came and were Lee's hammer and anvil at this point. They really struck a blow to the Ninth Corps, who had virtually almost taken the Confederate Army there on September 17th.
Okay, and Tim, do you want to go back into a bit more detail about why it takes 2 hours to get across the bridge, as you was going to say?
Yeah, sure. So it boils down to this. So there was a backup. The bridge is narrow as you're looking at, so you've got to rapidly move men across this bridge. And if you go there and keep in mind, you've been fighting, it's coming up midday, it's still warm this time of the year. But, especially if you look from the Confederate perspective, once you're across this bridge, it is straight uphill. And then you get to the top of that hill and you go past it. And what do you have beyond that? Another hill. And then another hill. And it's very up and down. So the terrain there could not be more different on the southern part of town below the Boonesboro Road than it is from the northern side. It's just ravine and gully after ravine. It's very broken terrain until you get up to where the Confederate position pretty much is, just on the southern end of the town and along the Harper's Ferry Road, where it's finally, flat tableland up there. But below that, if you're looking, you just see this rolling down ridges.
Sorry, but it's 100 feet upwards, isn't it? It's 100 feet in height.
Yeah, and that's
right?
just above the bridge.
Yeah.
And you've got to get divisions across this bridge. And keep in mind, there's bodies, and you've got to move artillery and wagons, and you've got to resupply your men who have been fighting for 2 hours. So it is not a simple task, and to a degree, you probably have to sympathize a little bit with the Ninth Corps men and with their leaders who are trying to get this attack restarted. And at this point, it really is towards the end of the day. But it was not easy. And one thing Tyler mentioned, the 4th Rhode Island, that's another interesting distant family connection. So within the 4th Rhode Island was a guy named musician. Don't know if he was carrying a weapon that day or not, but he was wounded. His name was Calixa Lavallee. He was like a 4th cousin of mine. But what's interesting about him is this guy was born in Canada. Had lived for a few years in Rhode Island. After the war, he became the guy famous for writing the music for what's become known as "O Canada," the Canadian national anthem. But he was a soldier in the 4th Rhode Island, wounded in action there September 17th at Antietam in Maxie Gregg's portion of AP Hill's counterattack.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on then to why the middle crossing is not utilised. And could you tell us a little bit more about the middle crossing, if you wouldn't mind, Tim?
So there's a couple different ways to think about that, and interpretations are somewhat changing. Historically, a lot of people have said McClellan didn't commit his forces. They committed them piecemeal, and that he kept large portions of them back, namely the 5th and 6th Corps. As it turns out, in the American Battlefield Trust, and that's a good picture that you've got put up there, because that's from that high ground in vicinity of the Visitor Center.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about that later on, yeah.
So that was the key terrain. And after this, the 2nd Corps, Sedgwick's division gets pushed back, in the all at the same time. And it wasn't nearly as piecemeal as people may think. It wasn't just the 1st Corps, then the 12th Corps, then Sedgwick's division, and then French, and then Richardson. Many of these things are happening simultaneously. Probably the most important one is the 12th Corps division of George Sears Green, which moves in just in vicinity. His right flank's going to rest just north of the Dunker Church there, his left will kind of bend back onto this high ground where the cannons are in this painting. But eventually the Sixth Corps, a division of the Sixth Corps, will move up and will occupy that terrain. So the Sixth Corps, actually, they had come from the Maryland Heights area. They had been part of McClellan's reserve, meaning that at this stage, towards the late afternoon, mid to late afternoon, the only reserve he has left is the Fifth Corps under his most trusted commander, Fitzjohn Porter. And there's a couple things about the Fifth Corps that stands out. He's got a division of regulars. These are the professional soldiers of the Union Army. And the regulars will send out, they'll cross the bridge. He also has Pleasanton's cavalry division there, kind of attached to the Fifth Corps. But that's what McClellan thinks he has. And he is not aware whether he was wrong here. That is up for debate. But opposing the Fifth Corps, the regulars, namely, I think the 12th was the big one, sending out skirmishers up, meeting very little resistance. Lee just had nothing left. He had some batteries there on the Cemetery Hill area, but there really was not much infantry opposing him. But the reason was that was McClellan's reserve. Now imagine that you're McClellan and you still have that, and things have been going well, and now you've got hit on your southern flank by that counterattack by A.P. Hill. You're not forced back across the bridge, but you've got to start thinking, and we do know, of course, McClellan liked to overestimate Confederate strength. He didn't know he outnumbered Lee 2-1. So it seems that at that time, the counterattack, was realizing all of McClellan's worst fears. He didn't know that Lee was as tapped out, if obviously more tapped out than he was in terms of strength. So,
okay, cool. Thanks for adding that. So anyway, as we know, it's known as the single bloodiest day in American history, and I just want to talk about the casualties before we move on to the next subject. So it was well over 22,000 casualties, wounded, dead, or missing. The biggest loss of life during a battle before that was Shiloh, and that was 2 days. So, this really does shock the nation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on with some famous photographs that were taken. But it is technically a Union victory, and this is what Lincoln's been waiting for. And of course, it gives him the opportunity to release the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Tim, do you want to just quickly gloss over that for us?
Sure. So Lincoln had actually decided in the summer that he was going to do this, that he was going to release the Emancipation Proclamation to free the enslaved persons living in the areas then currently in rebellion. So that's key. However, members of his cabinet, to include Seward, Secretary of State Seward, persuade him that it would look like an act of desperation after the relative disaster of the Peninsula Campaign, and then you have Second Manassas. So yes, Lincoln's waiting for a victory. And tactically speaking, he captured, McClellan captures Train. He captures that area around the Dunker Church. He captures the Bloody Lane. He gets across Burnside Bridge. Does he rout Lee's army? No. But Lee's Maryland campaign has nowhere to go at this point but back across into Shepherdstown for an operational victory for McClellan. Lincoln turns it into a strategic victory, however, because he'll change the focus of war. Up to this point, all you heard was, preserve the Union. And this will lend moral weight. It'll also do other things. And Lincoln showed his strategic genius, if you will, with this, because he reckoned that if by making the war at least partially about ending slavery as a war measure, that there was no way the European nations, France and Britain namely, would come in on the side of slavery. And he was right about that, because Europeans would talk about it. So there was that. And yes, it causes a lot of controversy, even in the North. But in the end, he's able to claim this moral high ground. And no, the slaves are still being held in Delaware, a Union state. They're still enslaved. Those in areas that have already been captured, namely Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, any area where Union troops had, by the letter of the Emancipation Proclamation, areas under Union occupation, slaves were not freed. It was only those slaves in areas then in rebellion at the date this took effect, which was the first day of January 1863. So at the time of Antietam, soldiers didn't have wind of this, but come a couple months later in vicinity of Fredericksburg, this is going to be very controversial among Union soldiers.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Okay, let's move on to this guy, because this is one of the most famous parts of Antietam, and that is the photography side of it.
Absolutely.
And photography is, is being used at this stage, and again, it's going to shock the nation. So, Alexander Gardner, born in Scotland in 1856, Gardner decides to emigrate to America, eventually settling in New York. He then soon finds employment with Matthew Brady as a photographer, and on September the 19th, 1862, this is 2 days after the battle, Gardner becomes the first of Brady's photographers to take images of the dead on the battlefield. And he takes over 70 photographs, and they were put on display in October in a gallery, and this really shocks people. And I do have some of these photographs, so we'll go through them. Not all of them, obviously. Some of them are hard to find, but yeah, I mean, this must have been really shocking. What's your view on this, Tyler?
Well, this is really the first time you're bringing the dead to the doorstep of everybody at home, and the reason we say that is because you're right. When Gardner shows up 2 days later, most of the Union are already buried at this point, but there's a lot of Confederate dead still on the battlefield. And what a shock this is to send home, and how exactly are they sending this home? Why is this being published? Well, it's not necessarily being published as much as it is being shown in an exhibit, and I believe the exhibit's in New York City at first. Matthew Brady.
Yes, it is.
It is New York City. Okay, so there's a exhibit set up, and well, that picture right there, I want to talk on too in a second. But when this exhibit's set up, I had a personal experience with this exhibit in a way. The Pry House had set up about a year and a half ago. I went with a buddy of mine to the Pry House Museum at Antietam. We went up and did some of the medical museum stuff, and then went up to the very top where they had a special exhibit to where you could walk around and view these pictures as they would have seen it in the New York Gallery in 1862 with the magnifying glass and everything. And it was still, even 100 and little less than 160 years later, it was just absolutely powerful to see those pictures and know that humanity could come to this. So to be in the moment in 1862 and to first see these sights of what a battlefield actually looks like, I mean, it shatters the romanticism of war entirely. And not only that, but it shows you the toll a battle takes. At Antietam, like you said earlier, Daz, is the bloodiest battle to that point. It's still to this day the bloodiest single day in American history. And to bring this home to folks to see it really, I think, drives home the horror of the American Civil War and the shattering of that romantic notion of going to war and it being adventurous or it being kind of a clean deal. And that's what we see with this picture here that you put up again. Not 100% confirmed, but it is believed that this picture is of the dead of Parker's Virginia Battery. They're sitting exactly on the ground Parker's Battery would be at, and the National Park Service agrees with me. as if you go to Parker's Battery site in Richmond, Virginia, there is actually an entire unit set up for Parker's Battery. This picture is featured there, and it does state that it is some of the members of Parker's Virginia Battery. It's a very horrific picture to look at. This is the plateau in front of the Dunkard Church. If this is Parker's Battery, it's going to feature that young man that I mentioned earlier, and I do want to try to get, and Darren, whether it's a post I do later and send to you, I would like to get the name of that young boy that was killed at Antietam, that the father of that boy wrote so much to Parker to bring him home, and that attempt failed. That he's going to be in that collection of Confederate dead there in that picture.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, really powerful. I mean, when you've seen, I mean, I've seen colorized pictures of these, and that brings even worse, you know. But I mean, wow, what an experience going to see that gallery as it was. Wow. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay, let's move on. So this eventually is going to end in only one thing, and that is the sacking of McClellan. This is a really famous Civil War picture. If you put in Civil War photos, this one always comes up. Lincoln and McClellan sitting there having a little chin wag. So tell us about the sacking of McClellan, please.
Sure. So I'd like to save a lot of this, honestly, for our Fredericksburg episode, but I'll talk a little bit about, I think, why McClellan's getting sacked. And it's the non-aggressive standpoint that McClellan's taking. That was not to say that McClellan isn't entirely unaggressive, because on the 19th, McClellan does chase Lee briefly to Baudelaires Ford and Shepherdstown, and there is a very brief but fierce fight at Shepherdstown, and that is an attempt for McClellan to try and pursue Lee, because he realizes on the morning of the 19th that the Confederates aren't there anymore. They're gone. They packed their bags and hightailed it back to Virginia, and on their way back to Virginia, obviously, at the time, Shepherdstown is Virginia. This is the crossing point of the Army of Northern Virginia. So you have McClellan and just really, I think, trying to, whether it be feeling out what force is really left, or is it an aggressive McClellan? That I definitely leave that for you guys to debate for sure at home, whether or not this is a aggressive McClellan or if it's George just feeling out what's left. It's kind of, again, up in the air there. But it's going to lead eventually to McClellan getting sacked and Ambrose Everett Burnside, the gentleman that we had just talked about at that lower bridge there, taking command of the Army of the Potomac and leading it to a very controversial battle in December of 1862. So if you'll let me stop at the sacking of McClellan, I would love to go into it more.
Not before Lincoln gives my favorite trolling quote.
Oh, please do share. We could do that one here. Yeah, please do share. Go ahead.
Okay, so you're talking several weeks after the battle. Lincoln gets a telegram or letter from McClellan saying that the horses are tired and need rest, and he's still refitting. And Lincoln responds, very witty guy. We're talking, you know, you see all these melancholy things. And you can imagine the frustration he's feeling at this point, because where's McClellan at this time? Several weeks after battle, he's still at Sharpsburg. And Lincoln responds something to the effect, this is pretty close, this is off the top of my head. He'll say, General, you will pardon me for asking what the horses of the Army of the Potomac have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigued anything.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty deep dig at McClellan, and it's actually after this photo. And there's other photos from this time that I truly like, that I find very intriguing. There's one showing McClellan and Lincoln and a bunch of Union officers, and in that photo you have a lot of really famous officers. You have a young, sideburns George Armstrong Custer, who's still an aide to McClellan. And then you have a very interesting one also with it's Pinkerton, Lincoln, and a bearded guy. And a lot of people are like, who's this bearded guy with this weird, tall, army-looking top hat? And then you see a name, it's actually John B. McClernand. And you're like, what's he doing here? Because McClernand was a division commander under Grant.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
and he had come east for the sole purpose of lobbying Lincoln for command of the Vicksburg expedition, which is, about to kick off that winter. And, he was one of the war Democrats that Lincoln believed he needed the support of. And he never quite got what he wanted, but it's always interesting to see photos of him there at Antietam.
It is.
Taken after the battle, because it's so out of place.
Mm-hmm. Tim, do you want to add anything about the Gardner photographs?
There's that one actually with the Confederates along the fence. I think it was the first photo you had. The one before this. Yep. One? So that one on the left. So that's taken along the Hagerstown Turnpike. So when I'm talking about the ledge that the Wisconsinites and the Indianans are on, it's possible. Now, you can't really see to the left what's there. You need that to be able to definitively say. But it's possible that these are some of the Confederates hit in the back by the Iron Brigade. They're, firing from the ledge. At least at the very least, this is in that general vicinity. Because that fence and is a far greater obstacle than people think, because it's a deep 6-post or 6-rail fence. Troops trying to cross that, and it runs the entire length of the turnpike. And the Confederates, especially closer down towards the visitor center, and fighting that really gets completely ignored, because Confederates will try to cross this fence. And to be honest, this photo could have been of them. These are McClellan, we believe these are of Hayes's Louisianians, but later down by the visitor center, coming from the West Woods there, McClaw's division attacks up that hill towards the New York Monument and the visitor center, past where Parker's battery is. And they actually get mowed down by Greene's men, they have that refused flank up by the New York Monument. So coming up to the Hagerstown Pike, they have to cross this 6-rail fence, can't really tear it down, no time, and then get across the road, then climb another 6-rail fence. There's very strong resemblance to, if you're, looking at Gettysburg later and you're familiar with the Emmitsburg Road. Difference being is that it's obviously, you take a look at this fence, it's almost entirely intact. There, not much damage. Whereas the Emmitsburg Road at that point had been fought over, planks. Yes, it was still intact in many places, but there were probably more holes there than there were on the Hagerstown Pike at Antietam. So,
cool. Thanks for adding that. Okay, let's move on to some famous paintings of James Hope. And Tyler, you want to talk about these things?
I do, actually. So just as important, and this is a little post-war, but just as important as those pictures are these series of paintings done by a man named James Hope. James Hope was born in Scotland in 1819, losing his mother very young when he was barely the age of 2. At 9 years old, him and his father will move to Canada, of all places, where Hope's father will die just a few years later. This will leave a 16-year-old James Hope to fend for himself, and decided that the United States would be a better place to fare when he moves to Vermont. And at the start of the Civil War, he's going to be one of the first few Vermonters to actually enlist in the war. He doesn't serve long. He will enlist in Company B, 2nd Vermont Infantry, and was appointed to the captain of that regiment. He will serve at the Battle of First Bull Run, and by the summer of 1862, he will be with General McClellan's army around the peninsula, and it was there that he was recognized for his talent in landscape art that got him an assignment as a topographical engineer. He would accurately depict images of shrubs, of vegetation, roads, waterways, you name it, and it was almost invaluable to McClellan, and McClellan would use him for this purpose. Well, he catches, what we call it, yellow fever. There's a name for it too, a nickname in that part of Virginia, when the yellow fever or the Chickahominy fever that you would get. And he would still stay with the army, even though suffering from this. and then take a bout of dysentery in September of 1862, meaning that the 2nd Vermont, which was part of the 6th Corps, actually sits in reserve. So he's not doing much there. And eventually in December of 1862, just before the Battle of Fredericksburg, he would leave the Army. Post-war, Hope is going to paint some pictures, or some portraits, I should say, of non-really Civil War related things. Watkins Glen was the one where he actually receives a $10,000 commission to paint a scene of the pastoral community of Watkins Glen, the resort town that he ends up moving to take this commission. He's even gives a picture to Robert E. Lee after the war and asks him to somehow find its way into the National Art Gallery. But the reason I bring up James Hope and want to talk about his paintings are for a very different reason. And you're seeing one of his paintings, which we call number 2, that is depicting the Dunkard Church Plateau. And it's a little interesting at how he's depicting it. So this isn't necessarily the most accurate, and we can tell that he took some artistic freedom with this. The reason for that is this is showing what happens after the assault in the Westwoods when Sedgwick is in there, when they have moved out of the Eastwoods. By that time, S.D. Lee's battery wasn't on that plateau anymore. So this is showing kind of a time lapse here. What he does do also is kind of show the graphic nature of the battle. In the right foreground, just under the first gunner that you will see there, sadly, we see a Confederate who has been torn in two by a shell. You only see the upper torso, and his legs are actually off the painting there. He doesn't decide to paint the lower half of the rebel soldier there. But you do see the torn body of a Confederate artillerist. He does a numerous amount of paintings, so if you ever want to see some of them, I highly encourage a visit to Antietam, or just even online looking up the series of paintings James Hope does for the Battle of Antietam. And knowing, too, in the back of your mind that there are some serious artistic freedoms done with this, I think at the same time, it gives you a good idea of the scale of the fighting and kind of the intensity of what was happening at Antietam. It's not the pictures that Gardner's going to send home to everybody's doorstep. It's not the famous, bloody lane pictures that you're seeing. Like this one here, this is the bloody lane portion that James Hope's painting. But I think it's also useful to talk about because this isn't a cyclorama like Atlanta and Gettysburg, but you're getting panoramic scenes of this battle painted. And if you have been fortunate enough to see the visitor center before it's gone, its restoration, in the basement of the visitor center, these were hanging up on the wall. You could actually go in and see, and the interpretation too was fantastic, kind of describing what you're seeing in these paintings. But they're an absolute powerful just tool to use to visualize Antietam. And after Hope dies, excuse me, in October of 1892, the gallery he has this painting at, or these paintings at, originally flood and destroyed much of the other work, but it severely damaged the Antietam paintings. In 1955, an art collector purchased what was surviving of the Hope pieces, and the Antietam paintings were actually stored in an old church in Watkins Glen. The National Park Service in 1979 realized their importance and purchased them for $5,000. And it began the process of trying to bring them back to life from the flood damage. And the cost of that was $10,000 each painting. So obviously the National Park Service realized the importance of this. And not only does James Hope paint this, he paints other battle scenes, including Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, First Manassas. All of those works were destroyed in 1935. We don't know James Hope's Fredericksburg paintings, sadly. But the Bloody Lane one is an enlargement of a small version of the original scene that's now owned today by the United States Army Military History, or Center for Military History. And because of his paintings, it is argued that some of these visitors will better understand that day of Antietam in September 17th.
Okay. Let me just flick to the other picture. So you got the
Yeah,
Burnside,
it's a Burnside
one as
Bridge.
well. Pretty cool. And
There's 5 paintings in total of this whole scene. So in this one, you can actually see he does another great job. He's showing you the Muma farm burning there too, and you can see Piper's cornfield there in the distance as well.
Well, guys, all I'm going to say is thank you for coming on and talking about Antietam. It was great to actually go and visit it as well in person, so that was really cool.
I'm glad we got to do that.
Yeah, me too. And so what I will say to people is, if you're listening to this as a podcast and you would like to see the pictures that we were talking about, then head over to the YouTube channel. But all that's left to say is thank you, guys, and I'll see you all soon.
Well, thank you for having us.
Cheers.